Welcome back to Best of Reddit. Please be sure to mash that subscribe button, it's completely free. Our first story of the day is titled, Deny Me Workers' Comp. Paybacks are a blank. While reading the many pleasurable stories of ProRevenge, I was reminded of an act of ProRevenge from several years ago. It was a bad year for me and the economy was not in great shape, unemployment was fairly high. I had been working at a hardware store but things went bad and the owner sold everything and moved to Florida. I finally landed a job at factory. It was crappy work involving putting zinc plating on metal parts. The owner was all about profit and had little regard for worker safety. Somehow he'd get a heads up whenever an OSHA inspector was coming. We'd bust butt cleaning, installing safety equipment on the machinery, etc. Once the inspector left, the safety equipment was put back in storage so there would be no wear and tear on it. I suffered through it all, as did my coworkers, because we were young, had no skills or experience, and jobs were scarce. One day the piece of machinery I used, think of something that looks like a concrete mixer, broke while I was loading it with the parts. The drum fell, hitting the bucket I was holding. The bucket was full of metal parts and weighed somewhere around 80 pounds when it was full. This caused me to lose my balance and ultimately injured my back. I tried to tough it out, but I was in a lot of pain. I go tell the foreman. She leaves the floor and finds the owner. She comes back about 10 minutes later and tells me to clock out and go home. I'm young and naive. I know nothing about workers' comp. I spent a few hundred of my own money going to a chiropractor, and finally to a doctor. When I go back to work a couple of days later, I am informed that I have been demoted due to my injury. I am relegated to being a custodian, and my hourly pay had been cut. I held on for a few months before quitting and moving on. Here's the ProRevenge, it's a few years later. I have graduated college, got a good job, and am a little older and wiser. I come home from work and am watching the evening news. The state I live in has an office similar to the EPA. The news station did one of those human interest stories and interviewed the man who investigated the illegal environmental stuff. The story was about how he had dropped the bomb on a corporation that had been illegally dumping zinc waste. My ears perked up. You see, that company I used to work for used zinc to plate their little metal parts, lots of zinc. My workstation with that drum. My job was to fill it with the metal parts and then fill the drum with a zinc water acid slurry. Once the parts were plated, guess what the next part of my job was? I dumped the slurry into a trough which led to a hole in the wall of the factory, which led to a ditch, which led to a creek. The factory had been illegally dumping zinc waste into a ditch. I immediately got in my car and drove there. AHA. The factory was still in business and they were still dumping the zinc waste into a creek. I took pictures. I took video. And then I turned it all in, along with a notarized affidavit to that state inspector. The original fine was in excess of $100,000. They appealed and I don't know what the settlement entailed. The business closed shortly after. Sweet revenge. Next up we have another story of sweet revenge titled, Try to Squeeze My Dad for His Money, Tough Luck. He knows money. The background, back during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, Malaysia was hit pretty hard, especially the small independent banks. The Prime Minister at the time, Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, passed a bill to save the banking economy by having all the larger corporate banks buy out the smaller independent banks. At the same time, he made the One Malaysia Home Loan Policy. Under this, all larger banks that bought out the smaller independent banks must send an acknowledgement letter to the home loaners of their original banks stating the home loan change and must receive an acknowledgement from their new loaners, be it a signature, physical or digital. The story, my dad never liked how banks can legally rob people. For people like him who works the daily grind, having to pay the bank what is essentially 2 houses worth in interest payments over 2 or 3 decades is just plain wrong in his eyes. He strives to one day screw a bank over like how they screw their customers, a contract. Be it sheer dumb luck or God listened to his prayers and decided to grant him that opportunity, that was what he got. When my dad bought our family's first home, he got a loan from a small bank called DCB Bank. All is well, until a few years later the 1997 financial crisis hit. As the small banks were bought out by the larger banks, many home loaners received acknowledgement papers on their new home loan payment plan and policies by their new banks. My dad for whatever reason never received this. He only knew that his original bank was bought over by the RHB Bank Corporation, and that he is now unofficially their customer. My dad was frugal with his money and God bless him, financially literate. He knew that if he made a full settlement against his principal loan, he can avoid paying 30 years' worth of interest installments. Sometime in 2007, he went to a RHB bank branch nearby to make a full settlement, and this is how it went down. RHB employer: I'm sorry, sir. Even if you made a full settlement, you would still need to continue making payments for the interest. Dad: what do you mean? I have a home loan contract under DCB that states I can make a full settlement without paying for additional interests. RHB employer: true, but since you've acknowledged and signed under RHB, Dad, I've never received the acknowledgement papers. I never signed any papers from your bank, and all I have here is the DCB bank contract. RHB employer: sir. Under the One Malaysia Home Loan, Dad, you have to send acknowledgement letters about the loan transfer. Yes, I know. What I want now is for you, RHB Bank, to produce my signature of me acknowledging the new loan policy for RHB. As of now, my paper with DCB is still valid until you produce my signature. Q1 hour of the employer and her colleagues scrambling around their files and databases trying to find any acknowledgement from my dad about their loan contract. At this time, the manager of the bank had called my dad into his office to discuss this problem. It basically had went from civil to a shouting match that can be heard in the neighboring food stalls. My dad couldn't remember most of what was said, but the end of it was what he could still clearly remember, and to his son, it was probably one hell of a badass convo ender. Manager: I'm sorry, Mr. Mohammed, but you still need to make the interest payments, regardless of whether you make a full settlement. Dad: all right. I understand. I'll just have take this up to Bank Negara, National Bank of Malaysia. Let them help you find that signature of mine. My dad had the bank manager by the balls now. Rather risking a potential $1 million lawsuit and possibly losing his job, he excused himself to make a few phone calls to upper management, which took about half an hour. After said phone calls were done, the manager approached my dad, and agreed to the full settlement without the additional interest installments. To add salt to the wound, my dad requested that they have his housing grant ready within the week, to which they delivered. All in all, my dad managed to secure himself a house, the housing grant, and in the process screwed RHB Bank of what is equal to $60,000 worth of interest payments, which to a middle-class Malaysian in 2007 is a retirement fund.